Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
My name is Zachariah Seymour. I spent my early childhood in a rural area in the Hartford County of Connecticut. I vaguely remember my time there, living the tranquil life of a farmhand's son. I never contradicted my father. I worked hard during the day and prayed at night. Most of all, I remember the innocence of it. Wrapped in my own ignorance, carelessly and blissfully strolling my way through each day. I never asked for anything greater, only to be exactly like my parents. That was 230 years ago. Now I know what you are thinking, but please give me the chance to explain myself. The events of my adolescence are a blur to me, barely describable in words. My life became a tempest of chaos and destruction, of constant wariness and fear. I was shoved into a situation beyond imagination, with nothing but the mind of a child, and survived through a series of harsh decisions and pure dumb luck. Allow me to share with you my story. My story begins in early spring of 1779. I think it was 1779 at least. It's hard to remember. I was 9 years old, a typical child in New England. As it was, I was using some of the little free time I had from chores and school playing with my leather bladder ball. That damn ball. There was another with me, a girl, 3 months older than myself. She and I were the best of friends, a fact that set me apart from the other boys in my county. Her name was Lara. She was my life, my savior. She would soon become my destruction, my foil, the bane of my existence. And still, she is all I think about. I recall us throwing the ball through a field about a quarter of a mile from my family's home. We were still innocent children at the time, laughing and shouting and having the time of our lives. I don't remember which one of us kicked the ball down the slope. It doesn't really matter anymore. Not that it ever did. What matters is that it rolled into the deciduous forest, right by the brook. We chased after it, of course, but couldn't see the ball. I know that I was the one who suggested that it had bounced over the brook and probably got snagged on some roots. In suggesting this, I am equally guilty. We attempted to cross the stream, which was actually about 3 or 4 feet deep at that spot. I don't remember the exact depth or what method we used to try and slip across. In fact, much of what transpired there has faded from my mind, replaced by the grisly and twisted events to follow. Lara and I found the ball on the far bank of the brook. We didn't reach it, though. Instead, she pointed out a little cave off to our left. It was more of a rocky overhang, about 3 feet tall and reaching about 8 feet into the outcropping. We didn't hesitate to climb right in. I remember her telling me that she had reached the inner wall, and then I felt the loose earth under us give way. I remember grabbing her ankle, hearing us both yelp in surprise, and then everything went black. The events to follow should quell most questions you might have, save for the obvious ones that even I cannot answer. You will most likely dismiss the following as falsehoods. I did too for a long time upon returning. Lara was the one to wake me. We were in a grassy field with rolling hills that obscured my view of the horizon on most sides. Then I remembered the collapse and began to cry. We sat there in the grass for a while alone, before we regained our composure. Then we started walking, surveying our location. The field was unfamiliar, and the hills seemed to go on forever. This wasn't our home, and I remember the feeling of panic that welled up in me. Lara and I didn't speak much as we walked, until we reached a flat stretch of land overlooking a small valley. To our left and below us sat a large stone and concrete structure, weathered and crumbling in some places. It was surrounded by a few small buildings, some of which connected to the main structure. We entered the large structure, which we found to be abandoned, after about an hour of finding a way into the valley. The building was filled with broken-down machinery and extended about 3 stories into the ground. It was also 3 stories above ground. The style of construction was clearly more advanced than those of 18th century America, and we were afraid of looking beyond the first floor. For about 2 weeks we stayed in the building, trying to settle down and get a grip on the situation. We found preserved and dried foods within a room on the 2nd floor, which were sufficient in keeping us alive, though they tasted terrible. After about 3 weeks, we had explored the building to the fullest extent. Not a living soul apart from us lived within, but our entire view of our whereabouts changed when we found the armory. The bottommost floor was composed of 2 rooms. One contained a vast amount of broken-down machines and desks of unknown purpose. It was in this room that we found what I would later discover to be electrical generators. The other was an enormous room of shelves and clusters of items. The walls and shelves of the room were lined with an array of oddly shaped firearms and blades. Some were comprised of metal shards tied to the ends of sticks, while others had hundreds of metal parts and buttons. Some gave off whirring sounds and lit up, and others sat covered in layers of dust that looked for more ancient than anything we had seen in the building at that point. In addition to these rooms, we also found a library of information written in an unrecognizable alphabet, along with forms of command-based computers. We were young and confused, however, and dismissed these as unimportant. Looking back, the following 200 years of chaos could have been prevented had we looked further into this library. Within about a month and a half, we had familiarized ourselves entirely with the building and its surrounding area. One morning, I suggested that Lara and I take some food and weapons and venture further into the strange area. We left north of the building and set out away from the valley wall from which we had discovered it. A day and a half passed as we traveled, stopping to camp every now and then. We discovered that the area had a mild climate, consisted of mostly flatlands, and was home to familiar creatures such as deer, squirrels, and a type of fox. Once we were far enough away from the safety of our building that we could no longer see it, Lara and I turned east. We only had to walk for about half an hour before we found the second structure. Like the first, this building was made of stone and concrete. It was slightly smaller than the other, and consisted of 2 floors above ground and 2 below. However, the building was wider and longer than the first. The big difference, though, was that this structure gave off a mechanical hum, and some of the windows emitted a dim glow. The building was active. For the first time since our unexpected arrival in the strange land, I felt joy. Tears streamed down both of our faces as we ran to the building. I still remember my confusion and dismay when we found the building empty. To this day, I do not know how the electrical flow within the building was operational when we found it, but everything was covered in a layer of dust that signified a long absence of human inhabitants. It was inside that I got my first look at Lara and myself. Lara was dirty and weary-looking, with a defeated expression on her face. I assumed that I must look the same. However, we cautiously proceeded onward, exploring the building. We found more food and provisions in the building, as well as an equally impressive armory on the bottom floor. All of the technology within, including a lighting and heating system, were fully functional. It was clear that this new building was superior to the other, in that no technological repairs were necessary. We loved it, and spent the next 3 months living alone within. Then, the changes began. In hindsight, it was a combination of envy and a childish possessiveness, combined with lack of interaction outside of each other, that caused it. The little things one of us would do would set the other off. We argued more frequently, and began to view the building in a more possessive light. This room was mine, this library hers, that sort of thing. As the 4th month in the new world came and went, I grew bitter at Lara. In retrospect, I think that the place somehow facilitated these feelings. Perhaps the technology was to blame. Whatever the cause, not a day goes by that I don't regret what was about to happen. I still remember her exact words as we investigated the foreign language inscribed within the library. We began to discuss searching for other people outside of the valley, as well as bringing some of the files from the first building to the new one.
Would you consider traveling back to the fort?
Our nickname for the first building.
'Twould be easier for me to stay with mine.
Her building. It was a stupid and immature thing to get angry at, but tensions were high at that point. To speed things along, we argued. It must have been hours. We began releasing all of the pent-up thoughts and qualms we had with each other. Then the complaints turned to shouts, then to shoves, then to strikes. Then she grabbed one of the firearms we had been carrying. She was shouting incoherently, and I panicked. I wrestled the gun from here, pointed at her midsection, and pushed a button on the underside of the gun. I wasn't prepared for the weapon's recoil. It was aimed at a downward angle, so the kick forced the firearm down. A spray of glowing bluish lights issues forth, giving off a distinctive barking sound. I would later nickname this weapon the Malamute. The events of the next hour or so are a blur. At night to this day, I think of what transpired. A series of infantile mistakes that started a war. Lara's legs were burned and badly cut by the pellets. Some lodged in her skin, others ricocheted up into her thighs and hips. She half flew, half stumbled out of a vacant window and down one story into the grassy field outside. I remember both of us screaming. Lara didn't get up for a minute, but eventually staggered to her feet. She grabbed a single knapsack I had discarded just outside of the main entrance to the building and stumbled into the darkening plains in the direction of the first building. I watched her, tears of hatred and fear streaming down my face, until she crested a hill and disappeared from sight. My hands shake as I type this. Even despite all of the turbulent years to come, I have never remembered something with such vivid horror as I do this moment. My best friend, my only connection to the past. I digress. I now know that the weapon fired molten bits of phosphorus. It was designed with the purpose of scaring cattle and mules into running or pulling a cart, and had been later adapted as a weapon. Had I been able to handle the weapon's power and kept it level, the blast would have killed Lara. The centuries-long strife to come would never have happened, and I would never have returned home. Time passed, roughly 6 of our years. I remained in the building, never daring to stray outside. I began to exercise daily and test every weapon in the armory, terrified of what I had done, and terrified of unseen repercussions. I discovered before long that in 6 years, my body had not aged. I retained the look of a 9-year-old with the mind of a 15-year-old. Over the next 200 years, I still only aged about 18 years physically. Inside, I have changed drastically. But again, I digress. After these 6 years, I'd gotten to know every crack and nook of the building. I'd found a system of tunnels beneath it and the hills behind it, all connecting to hidden passageways within the building's walls. I guessed that the building must have been a military establishment of some sort, though the technology and style was alien to me. Once I had felt that I knew the building's geography well enough, I prepared to set out in search of more signs of life in the world. Another few years passed with no success. Time became a blur as I returned to the building time and again to restock on supplies. Every time I returned empty-handed, and not a day went by that I didn't mourn the loss of my friend at my own hands. I never considered that I would see her again. And in a way, I didn't. The person who I would soon re-encounter had ceased to be Lara the day I pushed that button. My search efforts had failed me every time I set out to search. I was attacked on multiple occasions by packs of wild animals, but never once did I encounter another human being. As for structures, I had discovered small, deserted overhangs in the foothills of a mountain range to the west of my building. The mountains curved southeast, though I never followed them too far. They led back toward the fort, and I wanted nothing to do with that cursed place. In my mind, the fort was the symbol of my stupidity, my failure, my pain. Looking back, I should have followed the range. I now know that I would have discovered a pass through the steep mountainous walls. Nonetheless, I returned one last time to the building and began to spiral into a lonely depression. There were only a few weapons within the armor with which I had not tried to end my life in the days to come. Every time, my fear and instincts got the better of me. I eventually began to find solace in organizing and studying the cryptic files. After all, that was what Lara and I had been doing before everything fell apart. I mention this because that too failed. I began to write down the symbols found in the files, but had no idea of their order or significance. Another 3 years or so went by without incident. By then, I had cleaned up the building and repaired its flaws. It was an isolated and monotonous existence, but I am afraid that I don't have much time left, as I have taken too long to recount these events. So I will proceed to a day about 10 of our years later. As noon came and went, I had been exercising on the second floor when I heard distant shouting. I remember the feeling of the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I rushed to the window and looked out. There, cresting a rolling hill in the distance, was a group of figures. There were about 30 figures, all human, marching in a rough formation. The feeling of awe I felt at finally seeing other people had gotten the better of me, and I rushed to the front of the building to catch their attention. That wasn't necessary, unfortunately. I must now be very brief. Perhaps I will explain in detail the events following later today or tomorrow. As soon as I was spotted, the group began shouting orders and broke into a run. I fought them away, brandishing the weapons I had, but I was captured. For days I was treated as a prisoner, beaten and neglected. To my surprise, the group showed no interest in my building or my possessions, but simply ignored me, speaking to each other in an unfamiliar, defined language. They carried weapons of the sort contained within my armory, as well as roughly made tunics of protective leather. As the second day of this treatment came to an end, I discovered the band's destination, the fort. She was different than I had remembered. Even though she had aged little in the decade and a half that had transpired, the look of emotionless hatred on her face betrayed her true identity. She never took her eyes off of me, never changed that expression. In the months of torture and captivity to come, nothing would hurt me as much as that empty gaze did. The eyes I stared back into with speechless panic contained only hatred. Though my captivity within the confines of the fort only lasted a few months, it seemed an eternity. I was shot, beaten, cut, and starved. In this time, I began to lose my sense of pity for the monster that had once been Lara. One afternoon, I was told everything. On the night that Lara and I had fought, she had stumbled out into the valley in critical shape. She would have died that night, but her hatred and determination had kept her going. Eventually, she reached the fort, looking for shelter and a way to heal her wounds. Instead, she found a band of raiders. The group of 50 or so men had come from seaside villages on the other side of the mountain chain in search of remnants from the world before. Instead of killing Lara, they mistook her as a surviving part of this world. I now know that the valley was the site of a gruesome and volatile event that took place eons ago. Lara had survived in these badlands. To them, she was more than a lost child. She was a legend, a goddess. The raiders were able to read the language contained within the files in the fort, and Lara was able to learn part of their tongue. After a few years of living with the band of raiders within the fort, she was able to tell her story. I do not doubt that she was able to twist her words in a way that portrayed me as the villain. I myself was convinced of that for the longest time. However, the atrocities that Lara would commit in the years to come, the deaths she would cause, have erased that fear from my mind. To make a long story short, Lara had eventually worked her way into a position of absolute leadership over the band. The raiders established a route between the seaside villages on the other side of the mountains and the fort. Slowly, the large fort became a community, then an army. I would have died within this fortress had it not been for the odd rate at which Lara and myself aged. Though we still remained young, the natives seemed to age at a normal human rate. As the season began to change, a group of natives from the original 50 raiders had grown tired of Lara's tyrannic leadership. They built up a rebellion of roughly 70 people of all ages. In short, the rebellion failed. Lara's supporters far outweighed her opposers, and those suspected of rebellion were crushed. The remaining members of the rebellion, about 35, deserted the fort. But not, however, before striking a powerful blow against her. They released me. I was taken with the rebel group, weak and weary, back to my building. It had been untouched since my capture, and it was there that the rebellion settled. I was nursed back to health until I was physically fit again. It was at that time that I was taught the language of the native people, and was appointed the leader of the building and its inhabitants. The next dozen or so years were spent bringing natives through the mountain pass and raising a camp around the building. By the next seasonal change, I had amassed a population of about 350. Lara had done the same, and she had numerous advantages over me. So began my war with Lara. 200 years. I watched as thousands of people died in my name, always replaced by more from over the mountains. I never forgave Lara, and I know damn well that she never forgave me. I could explain every detail of what happened in that time as I slowly aged. However, I only have the time to explain what I did. Needless to say, I found a way home. It's complicated, but the machinery within the buildings had the ability to generate vast amounts of energy. They could shake the foundation of the land, and the machines were able to interact with other planes of existence. I was only able to grasp these things because of the lore from the cultures of the natives. About 12 years ago, one particularly fierce battle took place. At the same time, a team of researchers within my own facility were able to get the machine to function. I considered telling Lara, but immediately discarded the idea. The Lara that would have cared was dead. So instead, I found her on the battlefield. Ironically, it was with a modified Malamute that she attempted to take my life. Her calm hatred of me had dissolved over the years, replaced with a mad and desperate psychopathy. I was forced to turn a weapon on my old friend one last time. So, that's about it. I can answer any questions anyone might have, but my purpose in recounting this tale is done. I simply needed to get my story out. It has been 12 years since my return, and I've largely gotten my life back together. All that remained was to get this weight off of my shoulders. Please do not judge me too harshly, as I do myself. If you dismiss this as fallacy, I completely understand. In fact, I expect it. I'm just thankful if you understand the message I'm trying to relate. Don't let petty differences rule your decisions.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.
There's also a Rumble archive as a backup.